Welcome! This time on WoodWorks, we'll make this classic Ottoman, built in a traditional mission style. Stay with us. Hi, I'm David Marks. Welcome to WoodWorks. For this classically styled Ottoman, we're going to be using a wood that's the trademark of all arts and crafts style furniture, quarter sawn white oak. The straight lines of the design and the careful proportions of the spindles are characteristics of the enduring mission style. The exposed tenons express a sense of strength, and the brown tones of the dyed wood give the Ottoman warmth. Before we start building our Ottoman, let's review the basics of building any piece of fine furniture or getting any project started. Once we have our design and our cutting list and we're at the lumber yard, it's always a good idea to buy about 20 to 30% more lumber than we're actually going to need. Now there's a good reason for this, because we're always going to encounter stuff like this, knots and cracks and some general defects in the wood. So by buying extra material, it just gives us some more choices in terms of cutting out around those defects and also for laying out for our patterns and our grain matching. Now, I always prefer to buy lumber in the rough when possible. So the first step with rough lumber is to joint one face, and that way we can clearly see the grain pattern and start to lay out for the parts and pieces of our project. For our Ottoman, we're going to be using quarter sawn white oak. Now here's a piece of 1 inch thick quarter sawn white oak that we've already jointed one face. We've used our cutting list to lay out some chalk marks on the face of the board. Now we can see there's a beautiful quarter sawn white oak grain pattern here, and we've laid out for our stretchers and grouped these side by side. This way we'll get some really nice grain matching on the Ottoman. Now also, knowing the approximate length of the stretchers, we can offset these to one side of the board and bypass this big knot here. So now that we've got all of our chalk marks laid out on the board, we can take this to the table saw and rough cut the pieces. We'll cut them out a little bit oversized. Cutting our pieces a bit oversized ensures that there's enough wood in our stock to allow for what's lost in the process of milling, scraping, and sanding. We'll be using this 2 inch thick piece of quarter sawn white oak for the legs of our Ottoman. Now it's always preferable, whenever possible, to use a board that will yield you the full dimension of the part that we're looking for. That way we don't have to worry about gluing together two narrower pieces and possibly showing a glue line. Now earlier we had talked about joining the face of the board, but we also jointed the edge of the board. Now we've got a nice straight line, and that way we can use this to reference up against the fence of our table saw and get a good parallel cut for the legs of our Ottoman. We've already ripped the stock for our Ottoman on the table saw. Now we need to get it flat. Let's talk for a minute about the nature of wood. Wood tends to hold some tension in it. And oftentimes when you rip that on the table saw, that tension becomes released and those boards can possibly bow. Let's illustrate this by sliding a piece of paper underneath our leg stock. Now you can see in the center, this is going to slide back and forth easily. But you get it down here towards the ends and it gets hung up. That tells us that our board is bowed and needs to be flattened. Here's some more helpful advice. It's a good idea to take a piece of chalk, make some marks onto the edge that you're going to flatten. And this way, after we run that across the joiner and those chalk marks are gone, you know the board is flat. Our chalk marks are gone, so that tells us that our board should be nice and flat. We'll check it with our piece of paper, and we can see that it doesn't want to go underneath there. Okay, so now Mark this side with a J, indicating that it's been jointed. And we need to joint this adjacent face. So we'll put this up against the fence. After we run this through, we'll have a good square 90-degree corner. We've already jointed a face and an edge flat on the joiner and established a 90-degree corner. Now our goal is to get these opposing surfaces flat and parallel. Now a lot of people might ask, why can't we use the joiner to do that? Well, the thing is, if we use the joiner, we'd end up with a flat surface, but not necessarily a parallel surface. We'd probably end up getting a wedge shape. And we don't want a wedge shape. What we want is an opposing parallel surface. So to achieve that, we're going to use the planer. Now the way the planer is set up is that the knives are set up parallel to the bed. So when we feed our stock through here, we put the bottom side down that's already been jointed flat. As we feed this through here, the knives will cut this surface flat and parallel on the top. Taking the time to properly mill our lumber and establish surfaces that are flat and parallel and 90 degrees square is essentially the foundation for all fine furniture making. By doing that, we establish the reference points for practically all of our techniques to follow. Now that we've got those reference points established, we use the sliding table sled on our table saw. We'll cut the ends 90 degrees square, and we'll use our stop block to begin cutting our leg stock for our ottoman to length. Once we've finished our legs, we adjust our setup and cut our stretchers to length. Now we're ready to make our joinery. For our ottoman, we're going to be using mortise and tenon joinery throughout. We're going to use that on the stretchers and on the legs, and also on these spindles. Now most of our joinery is going to be what we call a stop mortise. Except on the bottom of the legs, we're actually going to cut a mortise all the way through the leg. Now that will give us this exposed tenon on the front and back of the legs. That is one of the signatures of the arts and crafts style. We're routing the through mortises in our legs. Now for the through mortise, we need a good clean cut. And a good way to do that is with a handheld router and a carbide router bit. Now we've already routed halfway through the front of the leg. Now we're going to flip the leg lengthwise and route the other half through the back of the leg. Lining the router fence up against the leg stock helps us accurately cut the mortise through the other side. Then a sharp chisel is used to square up the rounded ends of the mortise. That way, they'll match up with the square tenons we'll make later on. To cut our stop mortises in our ottoman, we're going to be using this machine, a hollow chisel mortiser. Now the way it works is like this. We've got a drill bit inside of a square chisel. Now the drill is going to spin around and drill out our mortise, and the chisel is going to pare our corners square. Now we've got 32 stop mortises to cut in our ottoman. So by not having to hand chisel all those corners square, this machine is going to save us a whole lot of work and a tremendous amount of time. We start by making the stop mortises for our stretchers, cutting away adjacent sections until we get the length we need. Next, we'll cut the tenons on our stretchers. To do that, we'll utilize a process called batching. We've got our table saw blade set at 1/8 of an inch high, and our stop block clamped into place. Now the stop block will determine the length of our tenon. The beauty of batching is that it makes any process, like scoring these tenons, quicker and more efficient. We're using the same batch cutting technique that we used earlier to make our tenons. And we're using the tenoning jig to cut our cheeks of the tenons. The way it works is that by flipping and turning, you can use the same setup to cut off the rest of the cheeks for our tenons. And once we're done with that, we can change our setup, turn our stock 90 degrees, and batch cut our sides. The jig is set to cut both cheeks of the tenon. Then, by adjusting the setup of the jig, we make a deeper cut on the side of our stock, giving us the wider shoulders that we want. For the through tenons, we raise the saw blade. This will produce tenons long enough to go all the way through the leg. From there, the batch cutting process is much like before, flipping and turning the stock to produce all 4 of our through tenons. We're just finishing routing the bevels on our exposed tenons. Now these tenons will go through the front and back of our legs. So routing this little bevel here adds some really nice detail to our Ottoman. Next, we add a touch more of the arts and crafts style by cutting a deep beveled edge around the tops of our legs. Now it's time to do our spindles. We've dry fit 2 of our legs and our stretchers together. Now this is the best time to get the most accurate measurement for our spindles. We'll take this measurement, 8 7/8, and just add a ½ an inch to each end, and that'll give us the length for our tenons. Now I'll take that measurement and use that to clamp our stop block into place, and now we're ready to batch cut our spindles to length. For our spindles, we're going to be using a 1/4 inch mortising bit. Now this time, we're going to be using a notch stop block. That way, the shoulder of our stretcher can reference up against the stop block, and by batch cutting, we can ensure that the position of our mortises will be the same on all of our stretchers. We adjust the stop block to cut the first of our 5 mortises for our spindles. Using the same setting, we batch cut the first mortise on all 4 of our stretchers. Then we adjust the stop block, repeating this process until all 5 mortises have been cut on all the stretchers. Now all of our spindles should line up perfectly. Next, we score the ends of each spindle to begin making the integral tenons. For the spindles, we'll take batch cutting a step further. This time, we'll take 2 pieces, set them in place side by side. We'll do the same process. And by flipping and turning, we can cut all the cheeks in our tenons in half the time. With our joinery complete, we can glue up the sides of our Ottoman. Using some yellow glue, we first assemble the spindles and stretchers. Then, we glue the stretchers into the legs. We're just finishing up our glue up of our legs, spindles, and our stretchers. Now, one of the nice things about mortise and tenon joinery is once it's milled accurately, it's pretty much a self-squaring joint. So we'll just use a little bit of water and a toothbrush. We'll finish cleaning up some of this excess glue. While our sides were drying, we took our top 2 stretchers and glued some rails on to hold up our cushion. Now that all the pieces are dry, we can take the entire assembly and glue up the parts for our ottoman. Next, we make a plywood frame that will serve as the bottom of our cushion. We notch the corners so it will sit snugly around the legs. For the bottom of our cushion, we want to have an open frame. Now to make these interior cuts come out straight, we're going to use a technique on the table saw called drop cutting. Now we have some stop blocks clamped into place. We simply drop our plywood down and slide it forward. We finished cutting our corners using a jigsaw. Now our frame is finished. We can take it to an upholsterer and get it covered. Now we're ready to put on our finish. For our finish, we're using an aniline dye. Now aniline dye is one of the authentic finishes of the arts and crafts style period. It's a coal tar derivative, and it comes in a powdered form and it mixes easily with some hot water. Now one of the great things about this finish is that it doesn't have any pigments in it. So when you put it on the wood, it'll change the color of the wood, but it won't obscure the grain patterns and allow those rich, warm tones to shine through. When applying the dye, protect your hands. It's a good idea to wear gloves. It's always best to apply the dye in multiple thin coats to avoid streaking and lap marks. All that's left to do is set our cushion into place. The upholsterer did a fine job of covering our frame, and it's tailored to fit around the inside posts of our ottoman. This dark blue leather really complements the rich tones of our aniline dyed wood. The beveled through tenons tell the story of the integral tenons used throughout the piece, making the ottoman incredibly strong. The linear symmetry is highlighted by the ranks of straight spindles, and the warm finish adds enduring appeal. A true classic that invites you to put your feet up and relax. That about wraps it up for our mission style ottoman. I'm David Marks. We'll see you right here next time on WoodWorks.